Hello, y'all. Welcome back. It's Dr. Nicole Truesdell. As always, I'm your host and guide for this podcast, Abolitionist Dreamscapes. So welcome. All right, y'all. I'm back. It's season 2. I'm here. You're here. We're here together. I told you I was coming back. It took me a little longer than expected because January put my ass down with sickness. I had the flu, sinus infections. It was a mess. And then my kid got sick. So I'm now finally feeling like I have a little bit of breath in me and a little bit of energy to come back and do this thing called podcasting with y'all. Okay. So I want to also give a big shout out to everybody who's been listening to this podcast and who sent me words of encouragement in either DMs or comments on the various social media platforms that this podcast is broadcasted to, saying how much you really did enjoy season 1 and how you were looking forward to season 2. I really do appreciate that sincerely from the bottom of my heart, because it helped me be committed to this project. I really enjoy doing this. I really enjoy coming to the mic and being consistent every 2 weeks to deliver a new episode on some topic that's coming to mind, right? And for folks to care and listen and gain something from it is really awesome. So thank you all for the support, for the comments, and for the encouragement, because it really did help me when I was having to be put down and rest and healing, to know that I was healing and coming into this project, this space, once again, with folks who were open and waiting whenever I was able to come back. So I do appreciate that grace and that love. It's really helpful for me in my own healing journey. Now, this episode, this season, I should say, is going to be a ride in which I'll be talking both with myself and you all, like I've done in season 1, but I'll also be having more guests this time. And so this first episode is a long conversation, but a juicy one, between me and Tracie. And so Tracie D is an artist, curator, librarian, cultural worker, and founder of Rootwork Gallery, in operation from 2015 to 2019. A native of Los Angeles and the first generation in her family to be born outside the rural South, she has lived and worked in Chicago for nearly 2 decades. In 2023, her lifelong commitment to the right to read and advocacy for intellectual freedom and literacy resulted in Hall being named to both the Time 100 list of the most influential people of 2023 and her being selected to receive the Medal for Freedom of Speech and Free Expression from the Franklin D. Roosevelt Institute, an honor previously bestowed on Representative John Lewis. I know that's right, Tracie. So Hall is currently a visiting scholar at the University of London. And right before Tracie went to London, we had this conversation in which we were talking about the crossroads of our own lives and how we had met those crossroads and what we did and the ways that we had to engage root work in one way, shape, or form in order for us to navigate the changes and responsibility required when we must face decisions that are for us to make about ourselves. But if you don't trust yourself, if you can't hear your own voice, if you are still using the kind of perspective and sight of the society that needs you confined, then when you meet crossroads, they can become very chaotic spaces and places that feel as if you will never, quote unquote, make the right decision. This is where root work comes in to root us into the body, connected to the land, connected to our spirit, right? So I'll stop here. We're getting much more into it later in the podcast or later into the conversation. Before I turn it over to that conversation, I do want to do a couple of housekeeping things real quick. If you really enjoy this podcast and you want to support my work, there are various ways to do so. Please go to my website, drnicoletruesdell.com. I'll have it in the show notes as well. And you will see the number of services I offer there. I am I'm a creative, but I'm also a former higher ed educator who has transitioned into doing more consulting and coaching work for individuals and organizations who are interested in breaking institutional holds of what is possible and imagining things that are different. So if you're interested in any kind of executive coaching, group coaching, facilitation, and or consulting for your organization, please see my website and the different things that I offer. I'm also an astrologer. I talk about astrology a lot. We'll be talking about astrology a lot this season, y'all, especially the next episode. But if you're looking for an astrology reading, a journey to self reading through an abolitionist lens, my books are open. You can book directly on my website now and also pay. So you can go ahead and check that out as well. And finally, besides this podcast, I also have a Patreon in which I talk about all kinds of things called Abolitionist Dreamscapes. It's a growing community. It's a community, quite frankly, that really does support my ability to do this creative work in the public. So if you're interested in joining my Patreon, you can see below how to do that as well. The first tier is as low as $5 a month, and they go up from there. And I also have a Substack in which I do writings. My writings are going to increase this year. I was just starting off coming back into the writing modality last year. That's another episode about I had to heal my trauma in relationship to writing, being out of higher ed. So the Substack space is me coming back into the writing in the public as I'm also working on my book. So those are different ways you can support my work. Now I'm going to stop there and turn it over to the conversation with me and Tracie D. Hall on the root work of the Crossroads. All right, hello, welcome back, y'all. Season two, and this is the opening of Abolitionist Dreamscapes. So as always, I'm your host, Dr. Nicole Truesdell, and I got a special guest with me today. I have the incomparable, the top 100 most influential people in the world from Time in 2023, root worker, conjurer, librarian, speaker, liberatory abolitionist in terms of having us really understand the power of the written and spoken word and what it means to have access to those types of knowings and knowledge. This is Tracie D. Hall that I am introducing. So I want to welcome Tracie. Thank you for
Nicole,
being
thank
here.
you for having me.
Yes. So for folks who don't know, I met Tracie actually, I want to say a few months ago in October. I think October it was. I was online. I've been trying to work with different people, and I saw that Tracie had a workshop in which she was working with Mojo Bags and Rootwork itself at the Honeycomb Network up in Humboldt Park in Chicago. We're both located in Chicago for folks that don't know. And you know what's funny? I wasn't actually going to go to the workshop initially. I had my hair cut that day, and I had registered the day before. But I didn't get the notification that it went through. So I thought, well, shit, maybe I didn't get the last seat because there's one spot left. And I was like, well, so I was sitting in the car and I had just finished my hair. I was in the South Loop. It was only about 15 minutes in to get over there. And my spirit said, girl, if you don't take your ass over there and make you a Mojo bag. So
I see your spirit speaks the same language as mine, huh?
yes. So that's where I met Tracie. It was actually a very wonderful and beautiful space that you curated, Tracie, with your Rootwork, with the Rootwork focus of the God Bodies exhibition that you had. And so to start this off, can you talk a little bit about yourself, like how you would introduce yourself, and then what led you to create that workshop that essentially brought us together?
Yeah, no, thank you. First of all, thank you. It's just an honor to be here. I love the work that you're doing, Nicole, and I can't wait for this conversation. But to the point of who I am a product of the Great Migration, born in Los Angeles to Louisiana people. My grandfather has some roots in South Carolina, but my mother, father, and their parents have roots in Louisiana. Some of my father's people are from Texas, East Texas. And so I think I come by these notions of Black spirituality and conjure very naturally. I grew up in a household in which my grandmother was very pious, very much, a part of sort of like Christian belief, especially Church of God in Christ. And also at the same time, like most Black people, practice a very syncretic form of religion in which Black hoodoo was very much a part of it. And so it was never esoteric to me. It's not something that I came to later in life or really was introduced through study. I grew up in a household in which we had altars, in which we made medicinal water, in which we used salt for protection, and floor washes, and oils, and believed in notions of consecration. So I think I would describe myself, also as someone who's been um, very much interested in cultural work or culture work.
Mhm.
And so I just describe myself very loosely, even, though I've worked in a lot of different fields, from education, of course, I'm a librarian, to philanthropy, but I describe all of that work, even that work in terms of Black spirituality and hoodoo. I would describe myself as a culture worker.
Mm. I love that idea of culture worker. And it's funny because I'm an anthropologist, right? So culture is a big thing that we talk about a lot. But I've always I've always hated how anthropology talks about culture at the same time, because it really it makes it, and there's always a constant conversation within the discipline, right, about what is culture, how we define it, the ways that we need to move beyond the Western logic, white logic, whatever that is. But at the same time, there always seems to be a lack of true integration of culture being about those who you can see in a relationship with, but also those who have come after or before you who you cannot see. So the sacred and mundane is always
Yeah.
never really fully brought together, right? I think in a intentional and also seen as a logical way to understand culture. Right.
Right.
And so this idea of being a culture worker is really amazing. I think it's a great way to capture essentially the essence of what we would call hoodoo in the States.
Yeah, no, and because I think when I think about it, I'm just coming back. I'm 2 days coming back from Mexico City and Oaxaca, right? And I'm really
Mm,
interested always in the ways in which people use materiality, or material culture, or the ways in which people approach
mm,
um and integrate, as you say, the sacred and the mundane, right? And so, everywhere, I am in Oaxaca, Mexico City, I'm looking at the cups that people use to drink mezcal, and the handles are ears, and the cups are faces, and there's something that is a part of indigenous culture that makes us want to both do the thing and represent the thing in the same sort of fell swoop, right? And so I come from, I grew up, walking onto the back porch of our house and passing the bottle trees that my grandfather, because
mm,
my grandmother and grandfather, the house that they could afford in Watts, where I was mostly raised, was really had been a hospice. They were able to purchase a space that had been a place where older people went, to pass away, to live out the end of their lives. And so there were haints, around the house, that we coexisted together. And I remember, the bottle trees to really begin to temper, those spirits. And so, even though it's beautiful, it has a very practical purpose. I grew up with, my grandmother and grandfather saying, put a fork and turn it upwards, in this room. This haint's been riding me, all night. And, I'm trying to get some sleep. I grew up, with, I could say so much more, but I grew up with those representations of ways that we made our space sacred, ways in which we can, as much as we possibly can, control the atmosphere, in and around our homes. And so, and I grew up with my grandmother making quilts for warmth, but also ensuring that the quilts represented all of the generations that she could remember. So quilts that would have a little bit of my great grandfather's old jacket, and my grandfather's work suit, and one of my grandmother's, house dresses, and some of the clothes that we had grown out with. And of course, that was to keep us, warm enough. But in another way, it was to integrate and connect these generations, right? And so I think when I think about culture work, I think about ways that I engage intentionally um, to connect and protect the communities in which I've lived, worked in, and come from. And that's what culture work really is to me. And that art or material culture, materiality must be a part of that, right? It has to be, because that's the container. Just like the book is the container for knowledge, right? It isn't the
Yes,
knowledge,
I
right? The
love.
book is not the knowledge, it is a container of it.
Yes. And so then we have to think about, and that's really beautiful way to think about how I think about the human and the human body, right? As the body as the vessel and the container, right, of the spirit.
Yes.
But then do we know do we know how to work with the vessel that we were given for the spirit,
Yeah,
right?
right.
And right? And I think a lot of that, and this is why it's so important to have our cultural workers, right? Our spiritualists, those who have that relationship and understand the kind of deep knowledge that has been cut off because we're so cut off from the vessel that we inhabit that holds the spirit, right?
Right.
So
You don't
this
have a
idea of
culture
material
unless you have your
culture is like,
spiritual workers, right?
yes. And isn't that an interesting thing that when we think about colonization itself and why I really always call colonization a spiritual warfare first, because that's what
Mm.
they cut off first, right?
Yep.
Right, they
Yeah.
had to make sure that we cut off the spiritual workers. We had, so they were taken first too. I think we forget, like I know we love to talk about kings and queens and shit all the time, but like it wasn't just kings and queens that were taken. It was usually the workers. It was the spiritualists, the priests and priestesses, the farmers, the metal workers. All of those had different ruling primordials, right? Who were also spiritualists in nature. So we see the who was taken first were those who had that connection as a way to sever it as well, right?
Yeah. No, it's funny you say that because I was recently in Bogota, Colombia, and I'm saying that it's funny you're saying that, and meaning that it's really synchronistic that you're saying that, because one, there is a group of Afro-Colombians who are working together as artists in a collective, and they want an exhibition that they were showing. There was a woman who had made these resin. She had cast mojo bags. And, I'm very much interested. I grew up, my grandmother, wore a bia, Christian pious woman, that she was. But, we believed in Grigri. We believed in Juju in our home for sure. And so when I saw that, I was like really attracted to it. And it just so happened that the artist who made it wasn't going to be visiting the exhibition that day, but she said she got up that morning and something said that she should pass through the exhibition. And there we were able to connect. And what she said is that she cast those resin mojo bags because she had been studying pictures of the Inquisition as it was happening in Colombia. And she noticed that the drawings or the paintings or the renderings of the first people who were killed during the Inquisition were Black people, and that they were usually pictured with having these mojo bags in their hands, and that those mojo bags were considered to be against the church and empire, and that was the thing that had caused them to be killed first. And I was thinking about the way that, in Salem, in those trials, you can call them what they were. Not everybody who was killed, what were witches. And I don't know a lot about witchcraft, so I'm not a specialist in that area. I'm really grounded in Black survival tactics, including medicine and holistic medicines, and that's what I call hoodoo. But so I don't know. I'm not an expert on witchcraft, but I do know that Tituba, a Black woman who had been enslaved, was one of the first people, if not the first person, to be killed during those trials. And she was killed because the community had turned to her for healing, and some of her healing really worked. And she was seen or cast as a witch because of that. And when she was And when she was, questioned, she didn't back down from that. She actually said, and I'm paraphrasing, I move things, right? And so I think that we have to do a more careful rereading of histories of colonialism and enslavement and understand the degree to which what you're saying, Nicole, continues to show itself again and again through history is that it is a lot of times our healers that are identified and persecuted first.
Yes, yes. Thank you for sharing that. And it's also really interesting if you listening to your story, you're also seeing I'm listening to the power of the gree bag, especially for your line, because the mojo bag, the gree bag has brought people to you when they didn't when they weren't sure if they were going to come or show up or not.
Yeah, yeah,
There's a theme I'm seeing here, Tracy,
right, right,
with
right.
your
I'm
people.
very,
They're like, take your ass over there. The roots are
listen,
calling, right? But it's
listen,
really
right.
interesting. Right? But then too, it actually relates to material culture because and again, how I met you was through your workshop work, working with the roots and working with the bag itself. And you had told a beautiful story about, I want to get to that a little bit later about the dream you had, because it really it's really the crux of what we're talking about in this episode. But the idea of material culture, right, and materiality and what we have relationship with that we also create, then also brings us to the roots, right? Because it brings
Yeah,
us literally to then the materiality of our existence and where we come from, the earth, the soil, right? And even within that, like the soil itself is where we bury our dead. Usually, most people bury their dead in the soil somewhere, right? So then this connection with the soil is also where we connect with our roots, our ancestors as well. But then we also think about the disconnection we have with the earth because of the way that we have been taught through colonial projects that we're supposed to dominate over and take from and essentially rape and pillage, right? We rape and
right.
pillage both our one another and our actual materiality too. So for you then, because again, I'm hearing in your line, root work is really important through the idea of Greek, the grigri, the juju, the ability to have those connections, right? So can you talk a little bit more then about your relationship then with materiality via soil, via land itself, and then how that has connected you with your lineage, and then in particular the kind of tools y'all, one of the tools it seems you all use in your line, which is the bag.
Yeah. Well, I think the connection to earth and soil for me has been really constant because as you were saying that, I thought about how I lived the first several years of my life in the dirt, really, because I think so many stories. It's really interesting that you asked this because I think that how I got a chance to know the world around me was by looking down and by inspecting the soil. I remember when I was a child, I knew where every ant mound was, where, all of the snails were hanging out, where the worms were. I remember digging and trying to find out and observing. I also remember my grandmother having a real mandate about understanding to not only soil, but the things that grew out of the soil and the difference. I remember my grandmother, and I tell this story because this is the it says a lot about who my grandmother was. She was raised on a farm. My great grandfather, Joseph Pierce Sanders, was able, after some sharecropping and intentionality, to acquire about 200 acres in Grand Cane, Louisiana. So my grandmother grew up on the farm, where my grandfather um, really lived a very much more itinerant lifestyle, just moving different places and working, because his parents died very early when he was a child. And so my grandmother, I think, because of that, you know, part of her teaching included us understanding the land. And even when, we were in Los Angeles, I remember my grandfather would have different hounds because we had a double lot there. Because the space had been a commercial space, it was like a big home, but it had a bigger sort of like lot or yard attached to the house that I grew up in. And my grandmother, I remember one day she said, why you see the dog over there eating grass, one of the dogs? And I said, yes. She said, "Why do you think the dog is eating grass?" And I said, "Oh, because the dog is sick. Because you said that sometimes when dogs, have like a stomach ache, they eat grass to kind of cure themselves and work through it." And she said, "Yes, but there's grass all over the yard. Why do you think the dog is eating that grass?" And
Mm,
she said, "I want you to be able to tell me." And I remember that was like my sort of invitation, if you will, to go and inspect the grass, to begin to understand the difference of the different types of grasses that were growing. Because in any kind of yard, there's like sometimes, you might have a hybrid sort of grass, but there's a lot of different types of grass growing in one grass ecosystem. And so it really kind of allowed me to kind of be able to be more discerning, to see the difference, in the kinds of things that were interdependent on each other, and to really begin to understand the micro differences, if you will, in terms of living things. And I thank my grandmother for that, because it also helped me to read the conditions. Things that look the same, that appear the same, have vast differences, and dogs know that, right? And
mhm.
how much more, should we as humans begin to look more deeply, to feel things? So I think I learned a lot by looking down. And I remember also later my grandmother, a wheelbarrow, she was pushing a wheelbarrow, and it kind of slipped and it fell on her toe, and it cut her toe really, really deeply, right in the nail bed. And for some reason, I took dirt. I was about 7 or 8 when this happened. I took dirt from around an ant mound, and I, as the blood was coming out, I packed my grandmother's toe with that, and then went in the house and was able to call the ambulance on my grandmother's behalf, and we ended up going. And I remember my mother telling me that my grandmother had relayed to her that the doctor asked her who had packed her toe with the soil, because it had saved the toe, and she had
Oh,
told him it was her granddaughter. And he wanted to know who had taught me that. And that was a conversation my mother relayed to me. But I remember thinking, I think my grandmother had taught me, if not so much to pack her toe bed with her nail bed with that, but she had taught me so much about the soil that I had kind of in my mind surmised that it was so much blood, it needed to be stopped, that soil would be the best, and that soil that was around where ants had been working with the soil would be the best soil, right? So I think
mm,
that, that kind of sort of being close to the ground, and the sort of philosophy that arises from watching um, the natural world, the kind of knowing that it gives you, I think children do well. And when I was a librarian, I actually taught a little science camp, because I noticed a lot of our children couldn't afford to go to the expensive camps that were happening. And I taught a series of camps. Actually, I asked friends to teach. I had a great friend who was an English professor teach a creative writing camp for children at the library for free. But I taught the science camp, and I got everybody magnifying glasses, and we spent the whole week observing insects and writing about it. And we began to compare field notes and just trying to teach them the techniques. But I guess what I would say is that I hadn't thought about it until you said it, but in addition to understanding roots and root work and herbs and flora fauna and all those other things, we learn a lot just by understanding soil and why animals might interact with with the natural world, and with things that are growing in the ways in which they do.
oh, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that, because this is a great example. And I wanted the listeners to really understand what Tracie just gave us is an example of a logic, right? The kind of knowing of a logic that comes with like practice, and then the theory behind it that comes together so that when a situation occurs, excuse me, you can deploy the under the logic. And the logic it seems you were using is a logic, an indigenous logic, but an indigenous knowledge, but coming specifically from an understanding of the relationship we have with other forms of life. So this is not a Western logic, y'all, that Tracie's giving us. It's an indigenous knowing that comes when you allow your body to have an interaction with the things around you, so you see how it relates to each other. Does that make sense? All right. So I
Totally.
think, and I love that, right? Because that's the biggest thing that for me is really important about root work, is that it requires us to learn and understand different logics, different knowings, right? It's requiring us to listen to something other than another human being in a particular setting that we have been deemed to be the only space to learn from, right? Right. So we're learning from, we have to listen to and hear what the plants say, listen to and hear what the animals are saying. What is the bird saying? If you don't hear them, what is that telling you, right? Like science speaks. I mean, silence is so loud, right? So this is the root work, but root work really requires us to be embodied, right? Because like you said earlier, the vessel that we have. So if the vessel is is a book, the vessel is the body. Do we know how to work with that vessel, right? And I think that root work allows us to figure out how to come back and work with the body, right? In a way. Right. But also then we also have at our disposal not just root work and the roots. We also have what we all learn a lot about as crossroads, right? Is the idea of the crossroads and the place that we go to lay mostly times our roots down, right? So you got to put the roots somewhere. You can put them in a gree bag. And I want you to talk about how you understand gree bags, Tracie, as well, since you also work with them so much. But then also you got to put them somewhere. Even in the gree bag, after a while, they need to go somewhere, right? And many times we are taught to take them to a crossroad, either a 3 or 4-way stop. But what is that? What is the significance of that for you, Tracie, and especially our listeners? Like, what is the crossroads? Why do we put anything there, right? And then why do you in particular like to work then with the roots through something like a gree bag?
Yeah, well, I think the crossroads is definitely one of the most important kind of spiritual geographies that we all have access to.
Mhm.
And I think it is an external manifestation of the place we all arrive at some point in our lives, and many times when we sort of see multiple outcomes, and
Mhm.
we may be not as sure of what we want the end to be. And I say that because I think that crossroads really occur when you really are sort of at that place also where you're being kind of like you're at a stopping point because something is also inviting or beckoning you to give it to spirit. And we have to understand that kind of release and that kind of surrender, because I know for myself that rarely am I able to discern a crossroads when I'm very clear of what my direction is, right? When I'm very clear, it's just, it's just a pass through point, right? I'm going, down this road, and I know there are alternate paths, but I'm very focused. But I also think that the power of coming to the crossroads or finding yourselves on the crossroads is the opportunity for recreation and for surrender, and also for the help that the spiritual realm provides, right? And let's kind of understand the reason why the spiritual realm exists within our discerning, right? Why we're able to discern is because there are the various planes of power, right? We live, at one plane, and if we're lucky, we're always like I always say that, when I was little, a 13-inch TV was huge, to me. And then I remember we began to normalize a 25-inch TV, and I didn't think it could get any better, bigger than that. And I'm not a big TV watcher. But then we normalized the 40-inch TV, and now the 50-inch TV. And someone was telling me the other day that he'd watched the game on his new 65-inch or something like that. I'm like, what? So what I would offer, and this is just my take on it, imagine that we live our lives, our everyday lives, on a 25-inch screen.
Mm.
When we are able to really align with spirit, the screen expands and expands and expands and expands. And so, what I would say is that I think there are times when we are being asked to surrender, to live, to allow our lives to move to another plane or another sort of level of screen. And I think that's when we also come to the crossroads. I come to the crossroads when maybe my capacity to dream is not as big as what the opportunity might be. And so I think also that the crossroads also becomes a point of also sacrifice in the sense of also understanding that support has been provided. And I think about places that I have encountered the crossroads. I've used them in ways when I'm trying to manifest or to surrender, when I need help, I need clarity. And I've also used them when clarity has been provided. I have been in places where I've been so blessed and not able to really name it. I remember one time when I lived in Pilsen, where Rootwork was, I was crossing the street and I had bought all this amazing fruit. I'm telling you, I was imagining this fruit salad. And the bag was like super sturdy. And I'm walking across the street and all of the fruit and Rootwork was on a crossroads. All of the fruit fell to the street. And I
Oh, I would
realized
love
that
to
that was
see.
spirit saying, listen, okay, this fruit is for me. I've also been to Bahia and, and seen some of the most incredible community uses of the crossroads with eggs and fowl and beautiful vegetables and watching and in the in major crossroads, major thoroughfares, and all of the cars obeying and understanding what it is and going around it, and also being in small dirt roads and walking around sacrifice that has been left in the crossroads, anything from coins to sometimes more precious items stomped into the ground. It is, in many ways, I would say, Nicole, it is one of those indigenous practices that exists in almost every culture, the use of that sacred geography, which is a crossroads. For me, in many ways, I see the gree or mojo bag as a way of traveling with intention, right? It
Mm.
is a way of making that portable. Um, the intention, the healing, the I need good luck. I'm having this meeting before you and I sat down. One of the first things that I did was set out my candle and I poured a little nutmeg on it, right? Because that's the closer and that's a reminder that no matter, I know I'm going to have a good conversation with you, but it is a reminder for me that this conversation has a generative intent, meaning that whomever is going to listen in real time or much later as this is archived, that they would get the things that they need, and that I would use my tongue, and that we would use this conversation to make sure that it not just serve us, but that it serves those who would listen. For me, nutmeg is one of those things that is a good traveler for your gree bag. But whatever you're trying to manifest, to travel with, that you need for protection or to make sure there's certain types of outcomes, that is the gree bag. And I would say this, it isn't always something that is tied on around one's neck or one's arm or one's ankle or one's waist. These are traditional places that we might find it. It is something that we knew to travel with. Someone might bunch up their apron and they might have, a few sprigs of something or even just some rice to represent, abundance or plenitude. It is something I remember encountering a slightly older woman on a train in Brooklyn, and we're having this conversation, and I had a bag of things, and as she gets off, she leaves a little gauze bag, and when I open it, it just has some herbs. This is an herbs woman who is traveling. I mean, these are the things that we know. For me, gree is about in my home. making sure that I'm in intention with the kind of peace that I always want to have, and I don't want to have it disturb the kind of protection that I need to feel like I can do my work. When I'm traveling, whether it's in my bra or my purse, it's about being intentional about what I need to travel with to protect me. When I sit down at my desk to work or for a meeting, it's also about making sure that those items, what might have been in that bag, might be present over a candle or just at my desk. This is indigenous forms of representing our intention and helping us to manifest our needs. And it is something that every culture, even our perfumes and colognes, if we go
Mhm.
back to the very early, reasons for that, it is people putting that bergamot and that thyme and those crushed rose petals. It had a very specific reason. It was to help to manifest or to arouse or to stimulate certain types of conditions. So whether it is in the form of gree or something that we carry, or whether it's in the form of something that we reduce down to an oil or a tincture or even a spray, whether it's something that we burn, humans have always used the natural elements to create and arouse certain types of conditions that they wanted for themselves, or to ward off certain types of conditions or incidents that they didn't want.
Oh, there's so much there. So thank you for that, Tracy, because I got so many things, so many thoughts with that. So one of the biggest things that when you were talking that came up for me, right, besides spiritual geographies, that's a beautiful way to talk about the crossroads. Like it is a geography, but it's a point that literally can transport us to the sacred and then also come back to the mundane, right? So it's a space that you don't want to actually stay in too long because it will be chaotic, right? It's also a chaotic space that you're not supposed to stay in. You're supposed to actually make a goddamn decision, right?
Right.
You got
It's
to move
liminal
somewhere,
space.
right? And that's why it can feel so tight sometimes when you're at these crossroads in life. Um, but something that I really love what you said about the gree and how all of this comes together with the crossroads, about how that being a place where you travel with intention, right? And how you what you invoke with whatever you do. So same, like I light a candle for the Egun, the ancestors, with some herbs and oil. And also I gave something to Elegua because he was like, hey, I'm a crossroad. What you gonna do? You gotta talk about me too. So I was like, okay, Baba, like here you go,
Yeah.
right? So even how we move energy, as Teacher said, right? We move energy and we have to learn how to work with it because it'll work us. But when we talk about intentions and manifestations and crossroads and working with roots and how we use different tools like a reiki bag, you said something really important. It's about the intentions that you want to manifest, right? And the intention, what you want to bring about. But the thing is, I find a lot of times is many people really don't know what they want. Right. So like truly understand what they want, and what versus what they think they're supposed to want. So you said something also important where you're like, sometimes when crossroads also becomes a space that allows you to really dream because
Yeah.
it gets you beyond what your sight is, right? But when you really are so focused on your sight, you can blow past these important moments that you're supposed to reflect to kind of just keep going. And so many times, at least I found in my journey, that when I've met a major crossroad, which I did in 2019, it literally knocked me down because I had asked for help from the ancestors and they were like, bet we got you, ho, we gonna get you now because you opened up, you said yes, right? So the crossroad was a space that like I almost had to come to slow down and essentially break because I was manifesting somebody else's life,
Yeah.
right? So I'm working with all these herbs. I'm trying to like, when I first got reintroduced to it, I had like a little botanica essentially. Like my ass
Good.
had the candles, the herbs, right? Doing the tinctures, learning how to make the Florida water, learning how, so I
Yeah.
was trying to manifest, like at the time I was trying to make it so that I had more security, right? So it was about the career and the money and the solidification. But that was the thing that had to break, right? So the crossroad brought me into a space where I was manifesting, but the minute I actually asked for help from the ancestors, and then for me also working with Orisha, that other knowledge coming in, that other knowing that knew more, like could actually see more, was like, okay, well then I was asking for freedom too at the time. So this is where I thought I was going to ask for freedom, trying to be in the plantation, right? So I'm asking for freedom while also asking to get more kind of just security and protection while I'm in higher ed. And the Crossroad taught me that no, you have to, if you want freedom, then you have to be free. So
Because
then
freedom means freedom.
freedom means freedom. So that's the sacrifice. So I realized the sacrifice that I had to lay down at the Crossroads, it wasn't even because listen, I fed them so much. They were like, girl, we full, we fat. Like we there's enough energy here. What are you going to let go of? Right. So I had to literally sacrifice a concept of a life that I thought was mine. And so I've been really interesting at this Crossroads and thinking about the Crossroads as a space. And I love how you said as a space, a dreaming space, right? The Crossroad does allow us to dream.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of us are at least I'm realizing we have never been taught to truly dream outside of the imagination put upon us, right? So
Yeah,
when
but
we
that's like a
bring them
first
in,
world problem, right? You
it
know,
is completely a first.
let me be provocative for just a moment, and I'll be quick because I want to hear the rest, but it feels like something is inviting me or asking me to say this. To spend a lot of time asking yourself what you want, that's like a first world problem, right? That's the trap. We already come equipped with so much of who we already are and what we were born to do. And because it might not fit into doctor, lawyer, professor, executive, we say no, that's not it because the SAT didn't prepare me for that, or I didn't, take these types of courses for that. um I think the reality is that who we are meant to be because of what is needed around us is very clear, right? You are somebody that is absolutely doing your work. This, and especially, naming Dr. Gay, and what has happened, with the resignation of, our dear professor at Harvard and Dr. Bonnie, the um,
Mhm.
administrator, who unfortunately ended her own life at Lincoln University. I can absolutely say right now that if we're looking for liberatory space that's clearly marked liberatory space, we might not see it in academia. We might not
Right.
see it clearly marked. I'm not saying that there aren't people in those roles who aren't absolutely committed to getting themselves and others free. But what I'm saying is that, that's not where the bright lines are. That's where, in fact, I think, for you to touch and reach um, the kinds of people that you might need to at this time, you're absolutely in the right space. And so, I wanna say that because I don't want anyone listening to feel like they have to spend all of their time trying to figure out. Just get up and listen, 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 listen. For me, what I commit to all the time is that I always say, Spirit, wherever I need to be, take me. That's my prayer, and I always say that being in the right place at the right time is my religion. Because I think that if you are in the right place at the right time, the things that can occur for you and for others around you are so profound. And so I just want to say that because I think that spirit kind of stamps that on us. I know that I've come to encourage people. I know that I have come to reintroduce myself and to introduce others to the old ways. I know that I have come to break open the spaces that were denied to my ancestors and to be fiercely Black and rooted in Black ontologies while doing that. Because that's what people say all the time. You have been in a lot of positions where you were the first or the only, and you refuse to change or to shift. That's my calling. That's not just of me. That is my calling. So I want to say that because I want us to feel like that we don't have to look beyond that thing that is pulling us. If somebody is waking you up and saying that your thing is to make sesame candy and that's your thing, make the sesame candy and continue making it, and to see if the sesame candy wants you to make it full-time or part-time, or to bring it up on your job, or to, whatever it may be. I just want to stop there, but I don't think we have to look that hard. I think we just spend a lot of time in denial.
Well, I thank you for saying that. And I think that's why I want to be clarifying too. I think to get where you are, you have to break though the relationship you have with who you thought you're supposed to be and what you're supposed to do. Right? You know what I mean? Like, 'cause I think everything you said is absolutely 100% spot on. And I completely agree with that. But you've had a relationship with spirit your whole life that you've trusted.
Yes. It has
Right?
made
And
me.
Right? And so there's a way that there was a knowing you can tell in your spirit, right? There's a way that you show up, and there's a knowing because you have another knowing there, right?
Yeah.
I think that sometimes a lot when I think about the spiritual warfare part though of the colonial project that we're still in, like the colonization didn't end, we're still in the midst of it, that we're also seeing is heavily cracking because now it's heavily being challenged, right, by those who had thought it could dominate, hence South Africa and other places that are now pushing back against Western powers. But even within all of that, if I think about it in terms of people's responses right now in the West, in the US in particular, to what's going on in conflict in other locations, who are showing us what it means to push back against power, right? To have dreams outside of the colonial imagination. I really think that we're seeing how deeply embedded the colonial dream is within those who have been subjugated within the Western constructs, within the Western nation states, right? So like when I say, what is it that you want? I see that as a way for people to ask themselves, if what you're doing right now, is that really what you're supposed to be doing? Or is that what you think you are? And so as you are
Yes.
fighting yourself every day to get up, you are telling yourself, well, I got to go here. It's what I got to do. I'm just hustling, but your body is constantly breaking down. There's a disconnect with your knowing because the body is the vessel for the ancestors to talk to you, right? So if you're so disconnected from yourself, you can't hear them. So the voice in your head isn't even yours. It's what you've been told you're supposed to do your whole life, right?
Yes.
And I think, and right, and I think, as I agree, thank you for that, Tracy. I agree. I also agree with you. I don't want people thinking I'm asking you to like do some like, kumbaya mindfulness. Like, let me ask myself what I want. No, it's like, you
No,
know,
because I
but
think that we've built an
I'm glad you for,
empire.
but I didn't think about that, Tracy. So thank you for highlighting that.
But I mean, all of these things are necessary, and this clarification is necessary because I do think that we also have an industrial complex that's kind of that is kind of built on this self-help that is built off of empire as well,
Yes,
right?
yes, very
And
much so.
and people use those tools and they get to certain points of asking themselves about meaning, but within that context. And I think that
Yes,
that's the part that we have to refine, because even this idea that you have to conquer other lands and even you haven't even derived meaning from where you are, that's a problem. And I could say a lot more about that, because one of the things that I think about global gentrification, when you see the wealthiest or the people who enjoy the greatest privilege trying to run away from problems that have been created in certain parts of the West, and then trying to satellite those hegemonies into other parts of the world that might be less capitalized, only to recreate those systems. That's a problematic as well, and that is a neo form of colonialism. And the way, I could say so much about that, because I reject that as well. And you can see that we, even by our reality TV and who we're choosing as like political candidates, you can see that we really have a drought when it comes to imagination of the kinds of worlds that we need to create. Because when we continue to stand up the same types of power systems that have gotten us to global warming, that has gotten us to not having voting rights in this country, that has gotten us to the points where we would question body agency, that has got us to this point where we would minimize the lives of women and children in the way that we have. When you see that crisis of imagination. You see people trying to run away from that only to reinstall it in other places. And that is the antithesis of root work, because root work is about manifesting the conditions in which you can live your prime life where you are, and humbling yourself to listening to other ways of being from the spirit world, the natural world, to understand how that happens and where you fit in, and that not all of those systems are built for your edification, but that your ultimate happiness comes and satisfaction comes when you learn how to peacefully coexist, right?
Okay, that's a whole ass word. We're gonna talk about this because no, we're gonna get into this a little bit because this is exactly what I wanted to talk about, Tracie. And that was spirit coming down because I completely because I will let's shake the damn table. I'm tired of having us believe that if you are black in the West, that it is okay for you to go ahead and go other places and make the same kind of enclaves and then call that liberation when you are doing the exact same thing we have been taught from the whiteness that has colonized this space that we are trying to run away from, right? And then calling that somehow the work of your ancestors and their dreams when that is not the dreams because you're disconnected from the ancestral line to begin with, hence why you are running away, right? Like, so I think this is absolutely what we need to talk about because I get frustrated as well as an anthropologist. Like, there is a reason why, like, I went to the UK to do my work and not some so-called quote unquote third world. Because I'm going to go to the location that created the mess to begin with. I wanted to understand the logic that was deployed that had them believe that somehow they were the embodiment of what true civilization was when their own people in their own location still have carpet in the goddamn bathrooms, right? Like that doesn't make any sense to me. Like they're living in a country that is literally crumbling at its core because it can no longer suck off the tit of everybody else in the world. Yet we're supposed to be looking here for the bastions of civilization when they're all also trying to leave that little island. Right. Like, and so that's why I did the work in the UK to really pull apart this idea of who are we studying and why. Right. Like I need to study the people and the systems and the logics that completely ruined our understanding of what it means to be human, right? By severing that relationship we have with our land and our people, right? And so I do believe what you're saying is absolutely both spirit led and on point with root work because so many y'all gonna be mad at me, but a lot of y'all who call yourselves spiritualists and spirit guides and oracles and priests and priestesses have no connection to the even the home you are in, the ground that you walk upon, yet you have this kind of bravado and arrogance, right? There's an arrogance that comes with the US and Western logic that has you think you can go somewhere else and just take a concept or take kind of bits and pieces of somebody's spiritual practices rooted within their land and context themselves, and then somehow make retreats on it and say that now you are healing others. It's like running away. Like you've missed your crossroad act. The crossroad is telling you to make a decision and have take responsibility for where you are. Hence the crossroad being a physical space in a location, right? But when you want to move away and risk that crossroad, you're just reproducing the oppressor that you say you're fighting against. So I think you spot on, Trace. You got me going off right now. Yes.
Well, but you know what? The thing that's so interesting, is that that's all of our work, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think about the UK, has to do this work again and again and again. And that's been a part of it, right? Like you can see geographies and the kinds of work that needs to be done again and again and again because it manifests itself. But I think that that's all of our project. It is to really to understand what we've come to do in this world and to learn how to do it with others and to learn how to heal ourselves in the process. I remember studying with Sonia Sanchez, a great, extraordinary poet, and writing a poem and her saying in the workshop, yeah, that's a mighty good poem, but who does it set free? And
Mm.
I remember thinking that, the responsibility, of all of our actions has to be to continuously look at ourselves and ask ourselves the questions. And that goes to, no matter where we are, every geography, every nation, every person. I think arrogance is definitely always sort of like a front for for feeling like, like there's some gaps, because
Yeah.
it's
Great.
all of that, and I think that obviously, to get high in any lifetime, it's imperative that you get low. I've always known that, that if your desire is to rise in any type of visibility, you must absolutely get to your lowest point, and also
Yeah.
to your most humble, and also be willing to be humbled. And I think that's an issue right now, because we tend to not support people who are willing to make mistakes, or to be found making mistakes, or to be humble, or someone who doesn't know the answers. We're right now pushed to kind of support people sometimes who feel like, oh, they can solve everything, or yeah, they're not a great person, but at least they're a problem solver, or they're different, those kinds of things. But that's just our battle now. But I love that you went off right there, because that fire, I needed it. I
I'm a
love
little biased. Sometimes I'm like, calm down, Nicole, calm down.
No, don't. Stay. Keep it. Keep the flame.
But I love how you said this. I completely agree. It's all of our work. And I want to tie two things you said earlier to what
Yeah.
you just said now. You said there's a drought of imagination earlier, which I completely agree. And then how you explained arrogance right there as well, to kind of continue what I was saying. I love, because it reminded me that we have a fear of dreaming, because there's a fear of imagination, right? Because there's a fear of difference, right? Because we're not taught difference. We're actually, it's very fundamentally taught to fear any kind of difference. So even when we try to talk about diversity, this is always my issue with diversity stuff, not diversity itself. Like that's a common, kind of a common sense thing, honestly, in any kind of
Right.
ecosystem, diversity. But then how we've understood and been taught diversity through time and space, again, because of the modern era we're in, is that anything different is meant to be seen as something to be scared of, to run away from, to like challenge or to critique. And so when we are asking for liberatory futures, and this is where I really do push back a lot of times with folks who stay within institutions and talk about refusal and talk about the decolonial, yet you are literally still within the grasp. And so the imagination will always be bounded by those space. We have to just acknowledge that. You ain't got to see yourself as bad or good, but just acknowledge that there's a boundedness. But we're so used to being bounded in our logic and sight and where we look to find new thought, right? That we're afraid when it truly shows up. Like we're afraid when we actually get what we ask for,
Woo.
right?
Okay, so you're just naming it right now, huh?
Yeah, like I guess I am, because that's something because I think that was where I was so frustrated at my own crossroads and why I had to. It was like my I think about this a lot. I talked about it on I think the first episode when I first came out about the what Yamaya taught me about freedom, um, is that like I didn't realize how afraid I was to truly allow myself to explore and be curious, right? Because the curiosity was always seen as something, quite frankly, a negative, even in higher ed, like even in a space that said it wanted to be curious. The minute you ask a question they don't like, you get blackballed. Like there is a real repercussion for that, right? Like, and so I realized that when I was at that crossroad and I brought that other logic in, this is why I talk about abolitionists breaking things, because they literally had to break me. And I don't mean that in that kind of misogynist, like masochistic way. I mean, they had to have me take that Oshun mirror, look at myself, and say, is this really did you really think we wanted you to be up in this space miserable? Like, do you think this is our dream for you? Is this your dream for yourself? Like, girl, we told you to get a degree. We didn't tell you to stay. But that was something, but it was through so much love, and it had me, and I didn't realize how bounded, because I got a lot of fixed sign in the astrology, but like I didn't realize how bounded my mind had inadvertently gotten, because it had been shaped by institutions who knew what they were doing. They know how to shape us so that we buy into their imagination. So I think right now we're at a crossroads, and I want to know your opinion about this, Tracie, especially as somebody who also was in institutions and now have left, right? So you were kind of making your own way, doing what you're supposed to be doing your way too, and on your own choice, from a choice it seems like you made too, right? What is it like? I'm finding that now, one of the biggest things is we're at a crossroads in society because we are truly having to face realities of what we mean by liberation.
Yeah.
And when we talk about freedom and liberation, I really do see this now a lot, where I believe it is finally cracking the one of the main conditions of the colonizer, which is identities put upon our bodies. They have scripts put upon them that we have to perform. So this idea of all skin folk or kinfolk, right? My question I've been grappling with, and don't hate me, y'all, because I know we love Maya, but who told us that all skin folk are kinfolk? Like, what was that connection made? Why was that particular understanding of skin privilege in a way that does not allow us to see the person? So now that we're all collective and we're talking about liberation and Black liberation, we can't assume that we have the same definition. And I think that's what we're realizing, that we actually are diverse in our understanding of what liberation and freedom, what it means and looks like. And so internally in our groups that are always been diverse, we are now also having to tackle the reality of realities colliding, and crossroads are here where you're going to have to make a decision about how do you truly embody liberation? And not all of us want to be liberated the same. So I want to hear some of your thoughts. And those are some really chaotic thoughts I've been having lately, but I've seen it so much on social media, and especially Black creative influencers who do a different justice, like they're going at it because people really are. What's going on in Israel right now really is having people have a harsh look at themselves and say, well, what structures am I okay with then? Right. And if I see them doing that to them, I know they're going to do it to me, but why am I telling myself? And then other people are like, but you have to still think about, it's not a single issue. And so like, I think we really are seeing a crossroads of people having to grapple with, okay, then what am I willing to put on the line to actually have collective liberation? So let me stop there,
Yeah.
Tracie. What are your thoughts?
First of all, I mean, I love that you are kind of weaving all of these things together because they are connected, right? You know, we shouldn't go, any further without, just mentioning the fact that, we're seeing a lot of silence around what's happening in Gaza. And we're
Mhm.
seeing a lot of people who have started their watches right now with this conflict without looking at deep histories of the way that power, and I would even say race in many ways, has been constructed. I'm going to use
Yeah.
constructed. Um, and we also, have a lot of silence to protect positionality.
Yeah.
We are definitely in a social media world, but it also means that the way that we've integrated that just into our collective consciousness is that we are in a culture that if you say something that would even put you at risk or put me at risk because of my connection to you, I'm going to call you out. And we also are in a space of a lot of collective timidity, where
Yeah.
people know that things are wrong and still won't call them out because they don't want to lose positionality. They don't want to use rank. They don't want to be made an outsider. They don't want, obviously none of us want to be persecuted. But, when I think about the kinds of activism that we have benefited from, even our generation, I see a lot of that absent of that type of activism really shrinking or being like more keyboard based, more of a keyboard kind of activism. And even that isn't um we have a lot more capacity to build movements today than than others before us did, and yet at the same time I'm seeing us not do that. But I want to connect all of that together to kind of say that I think that we are at a moment when we are lost in the sauce. And if we want to call it colonialism, if we want to call it racialized capitalism, if we want to call it neo-imperialism, if we want to call it neoliberalism, frankly, we are
Mhm.
lost in the sauce. And I think that that loss in the sauce is because we are not as spiritually grounded as we need to be to so for me, I'll say, like, if we talk about institutions, I'm definitely someone who loves to build institutions. and especially to guide them as much as I can in my person towards justice and equity, because I have that mandate on my life. Like, that's not something, and I'm reminded every day because I'm a fat, black, dark skinned woman in a world that has never awarded prizes for any of those things, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm in a body and I'm getting older. So I'm in a body that reminds me constantly about the invisibility blues, if we're going to cite Michelle Wallace, right? Or I'm in a body constantly that reminds me of who institutions write off. I was invited to speak recently out of country, and it was such a long flight that my guest, you know, um, got me some good tickets on the plane, right? And I'm sitting next to a man, and he wants to know what I do. And I'm vague. I don't say that much. And he said, "Well, you must do something to be sitting up here." And I thought about the fact that I hadn't asked him at all what he did.
Right.
And so I just said, to be cheeky, like I know I can be, I said, "I didn't know you had to try out for these seats."
I know that's
And
right,
he
Tracy.
And he kind of like, he was quiet. But I guess the thing is that what I'm saying for me is that maybe because I've been put in a body, um, a vessel in which people want to challenge my access all the time. It may be that I'm always aware of these systems that ask us to qualify if you're a person of color, if you're queer, if you are fat, or if you have a visible disability, if you have less income, if you don't have the blue chip education, that asks you to qualify how you got there, or to see your status there as fugitive. So I've embraced a kind of fugitivity in my
Mhm.
leadership. Like, when I come to rec shop. I'm John Henry on it. I'm not going to lie. If there's something that needs to be done, I'm doing it like John Henry. I am going to race the train and explode the mountain. I'll be out because I'm going to have to be on to the next thing, because my life is about equity and about pushing institutions towards justice. I didn't give myself that work. That work has given itself to me. And so
Mm.
that's what I'm on. So for me, the institution has to be in the need of that, and I have to care about its mission enough to be willing to sacrifice, because my leadership, I can only speak for myself. I know that some of this resonates, but my leadership is always questioned, even by Black people. Because I don't
Listen,
somebody told me the other day, they said, "You've done a lot of jobs, and not only have you been sometimes the only Black person, but if you are not, you definitely the darkest, and you are from the hood." I'm like, I mean, there's more brilliant people in Watts and Compton and stuff than I could ever hope to be. But a lot of time, the escape hatches are not, always open. And so what I'm
yes.
trying to say here, and why I'm saying this, is that I'm lucky in that my kind of leadership is never legitimized. Like, I can't even sit up in business or first class without somebody asking me to try out for the seats or qualify for them, who didn't pay for my seats, why I'm there. And so I'm reminded constantly. So I know that my relationship with institutions is because we both align and want to accomplish something. And when that deep thing, that tough thing, the hardest thing to do is done, then I get a chance to ask myself, where do I need to be? And I ask myself all the time with spirit, and I find that it's on a 3 or 4 year period when the
Mm.
the hardest part of the thing is done, because there's always more to do. I ask myself, Spirit, where do you want me to be? And now I feel like there's so much more for me to learn and write about. And I really want to devote myself to observation. I hope that I can write and get more than just journal articles out, more a longer form. But I feel that I got to witness. This is my time to, I've been witnessing, but this is my time to testify, to
Mm.
document what I've seen. And this is a time of intense misogynoir. We are experiencing a lot of vitriol and attacks against women, especially Black women, who are a lot of times, just many times, emblematic also of of how dissonant our talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion is. It is a smokescreen today, I believe, for racialized capitalism. I'm not saying that everyone who works in that area is not being genuine, but what I'm saying is that a lot of the institutions that, if we were to do an audit of the people who were hired immediately after the murder of George Floyd and who are still in those positions today, I think that that would help to underline what I'm trying to say is that for me, at least right now, it may not be next year or 2 years from now. Right now, the most powerful place that I can be is a voice, even if it's in the wilderness, saying something is not right. Don't eat that. Don't drink that. Something is not right in this system. There is some rot. I'm going to name it. There is something rotten at the base of these foundations that we built. There are dying bodies.
Yes.
We are feasting on decay, and people are masking it and flavoring it. But there is something that is not right now. And for me, the most powerful place I can be is to say that with love and not risk an institution, and where it might need to be. I need to be able to say that as an individual that I hope at this point by now is seen as someone who has integrity, who will not say that lightly, who is seen as somebody who knows how institutions, even the ones that I might be asking to change, function, and that and that has some connection with the decision making world and decision makers, because something is rotten. And that is why I think in a lot of ways we are moving back to these original forms of knowing, which is
Mm.
how do we live in equilibrium and in balance and in spiritual alignment with the world around us. That's what, again, I'm saying what root work is for me. And we need some of the root work in the institutions. Some of these institutions need to be aired out. I mean, you can't keep abusing and hurting people and gaslighting them. You can't keep saying you want something to come together and destroying it. You can't see
Mhm.
people taking their own lives, and before they take their own lives, crying out and saying, this institution and the way that it is interacting with me, who has been strong, who has been successful, who has led these initiatives, this institution is killing me. And then that person actually take their lives, and we go on the next day like nothing happened. These institutions are becoming more and more hollow, more and more illegitimate, more and more unjust, and we have to call it out, because as these institutions go, as these corporations go, they are the one that dominates the decision making about how the world goes. And let's look at global warming and climate change. We're in a place now that you can go to places that you have visited your entire life and see such severe erosion that you almost ask yourself, is this the same place? We are experiencing climate incidents every other week, and we're acting as if it's a surprise. We are killing the planet. That is why, Nicole, you are doing this work. That is what is bringing me together, with you. That is what years ago, I had a dream. I was working for a Fortune 500 as a
Mm.
strategist. And one week it was so on me to just get anywhere in Louisiana where my family comes from. It was just every night I go to bed, and it would just be like I could hear the voices of my ancestors saying, you've got to go back. And I luckily had a weekend, and I could do this, and I flew to Louisiana, and I flew to New Orleans, the nearest point that I could. And I remember I felt like I needed to take a nap, which is not me. I'm not a napper. I'm always like on the go. And literally, when I woke up from that nap, I could not move. My back had gone completely out with no warning, and the phone was on the other side of the hotel room. So I couldn't even get to the phone to say something is happening. I don't know what it is. This is the first time I didn't know what had happened. but I literally couldn't move. I couldn't even get myself to move. The only thing that I had is that I had placed my purse on the side. I didn't have a cell phone, there to call from, but I had a little pad. And as I was dealing with this, I could listen to my grandmother. I could hear her voice, her soft voice, leading me back through the garden that she planted in the house that, I mostly grew up in. And she's telling me all of the medicinal, all of the spiritual uh, qualities of each of the plants. And she's telling me, and I can remember that when I was 16, I went out in the yard with my grandmother. She said, "I want to show you something," and she began to reveal to me the spiritual qualities of plants, because my grandmother had been a root worker, even though she had kind of she worked root on you when she needed, when you were sick, when something was happening at different points in our lives. If there was some sadness or calamity, my grandmother would do her thing. But it was in this moment that she really revealed to me who she was. But once again, well after she had passed, here's my grandmother and me in this dream. And I was studying Ifa at that time. And when I recovered from that and went back home, I said to my Baba, I said, "Baba, this is what's happened." And he divined it. He said, "Your grandmother, she wants you." This had to be about 14 or 15 years ago. Yeah, it had to be about 14 or 15 years ago, if not more. She wants you to not only return to these ways, but she also wants you to talk about it. She wants you to tell others, because there are others who will be attracted to this, for whom this will resonate, but they may not feel comfortable. And it's become my practice, side by side, as I've moved up in the corporate or executive world, the deeper my practice has become. And so why? Because the only way that I can work in these institutions is to balance it with this knowledge. And I believe for all of us, that's the only way that is we're going to be able to survive. We have to return to the knowledge of care, of self-care, of community care, of the way that we heal together, of truth telling, of humility, of being okay with being different, of saying, I don't know what this is, but I just got to say it. I have done a lot of things in my life that have supported institutions, because I might say, we're not even talking about this, but something is telling me, let's just talk about this for a moment. It is when I have uncorked that bottle that we got to some real things. So I think our survival, come on now, I believe that our survival is contingent, is predicated on us going back down to the root, going back down to that radical place where we can change things, where we can heal things, where we can look at ourselves and say, the reason why I've been acting arrogant and puffed up and gatekeeping is because I'm not sure of my ability. I'm not sure of who I am. I'm not happy. I have this car, but I don't talk to my partner when I get home. Or, I'm sending my kid to the best school, and I'm not supporting any of the public schools, but me and my child, we don't interact. There's a lot of distance. Or, I have a lot of siblings, but we don't get along and we don't talk. Or, I have a wound in my relationship with my mother or my father. We have to stop doing the kind of disservice to institutions by blowing up those illnesses, those diseases in who we are and how we're living. Heal that so that you can actually be effective in your institution. And one thing I also want to say is that it's so important to me right now that I also heal my body, because the collateral for me, um, showing up as all those things, especially as Black women are asked to show up in institutions, is that I'm so distant from my body now. And so some of it is that I also have to heal myself. So in addition to me being committed to being a more effective truth teller who can literally be unbought, because of being able to be affiliated in a way. And institution affiliation is more as a researcher, as a thinker, as a lecturer, as a visiting professor, and those kinds of things. I think the other thing is that I also need space on this leg of the journey as I move more towards becoming an elder, as I move closer towards that, is that I also need to heal myself and try to root out some of these things that have taken seed in me, that might be because of being so distant from my body. I don't know if any of those things really kind of come together as we talk about root work, but root work also is self-defense.
Yes, it is. Yeah. Thank you, Tracie, for that. There's so many good tidbits, and then I want to highlight some things for folks when you listen in, and I want you to rewind and listen back to what Tracie just said, because there's a way, Tracie, you provided a template, right? And what I mean by that is you provided a template of what it looks like to have a understanding of your own knowing, and then without even really understanding why, trusting it. Right. And so that's what led you to Louisiana on that bed. Your back was going to blow out regardless. So your people were like, please blow out in a space that you can hear us and we can help you. Right. And in that, if you were using, and this go back to logic again, we talked about logic earlier. If you were to use a logic of the institution that is really a logic of capitalism, of work, right, of like showing up and, all those things, because you're using a logic that tells you as a dark-skinned fat Black woman, right, that you have to be perfect. You put that to the side because your own knowing and logic that came from spirit said you need to go back to your land. Right? And I think that's really important. And that's a great representation of a lot of the stuff, honestly, I try to teach. Is like, who is the self that is leading? Right? Who is the voice that you are truly listening to and then working with, even if you don't truly fully understand, but you trust in it. Right? And this goes back to, do you even trust yourself? Can you hear your voice? Can you allow yourself to trust yourself? And many times in this society, especially if you're a woman, if you're a Black woman, if you're queer, if you're indigenous, any kind of marginalization that society is told that is somehow not acceptable, right? You are taught not to trust yourself. You're taught to trust something else or somebody else or another type of logic. And so I love what you're saying is that right now we have to come back to spirit. And I completely agree with that. Like, we have to come back because that we are so out of balance, right? Because that is what we need to come back into a knowing. And we'll have different knowings. Not all our spirits talk the same, right? Like, we have to be very clear. Like, all of our ancestors ain't the same, right? Some of y'all's ancestors ain't shit. Some of my ancestors ain't shit. But at the same time, some are amazing, right? Like, because again, they used to be human. So we also have to then have a kind of knowing that when we work with spirit, it will also give us better discernment, right? But like you said before, you can't come do that unless you're in your body, right? If your body's broken down, you can't hear them. You can't do nothing, right? So I think a lot about this time for me is a grieving process, right? This is a lot of my 12th house, my Scorpio rising with 12th house placement. So me and Aiku be hanging out, having conversations all the time. But I agree. I think it's a big grieving process right now that we have to figure out, in order what you said, which is beautiful, this kind of right relationship we need to come back into with self, with community, with land, with everything we can't do until we allow ourselves to collectively grieve, right? What we know we must give up, but also we lost and we never got a chance to fully acknowledge, right? Because how can we come back to ancestors when we won't respect our dead? When we don't know how to bury our dead, right? When we don't know how to honor them and understand that we have to honor them. Not just be like, okay, buried yesterday and I go back to work, because even work dictates who we can even grieve for, right? Like, and so we won't realize how much and this is why I call abolition work root work, because it breaks so much stuff to get us back to the foundations of what actually is, right? And so when you said this idea of this idea of coming back to self, right? And also this idea of this kind of feasting on decay. This is what got me thinking about the grief, because we are feasting on decay. We're feasting on the decay of dreams that were never going to be fruitful, but we still think are the only way to be. And so I think this is why the ancestors are so loud right now and saying, yeah, baby, we don't want you to do that. Like, listen, we tried it. It didn't work for us. So why don't we figure out a different template, right? Because when you try to work within these systems, but don't want to ask questions about the systems, right? That's how it can really infest and cause disease. And so I like how you talked about institutions. And also the last thing I want to say about a template is you said something really important too. Because you're trusting your knowing and understanding your own tempo, you also know for you, you only have about a 3 or 4 year life cycle in a space, right? That is so counter to everything we are taught, right? Especially if you are Gen X, millennial, right? There was a disciplining of you go into school, you go into a career, and you stay there. And if you do move, you have to move up, right? You're only doing moves up. So there's always this kind of idea of never being present. It's always a future or a past, right? And so for you to be like, no, I know I can only do 3 or 4 years in a space. Like, listen, if I would have realized that shit, Tracie, I probably wouldn't have been so crazy. Like, there's a way, because for me, I was trying to stay thinking that it was my job to fix. And if I stayed long enough and did the work long enough, right, and worked with others and really kind of, this is the kind of fixed energy of me, like dig in, that it would work, and it didn't. Like I had to leave eventually. And so for me, I realized with institutions, this is where I go to astrology, because astrology to me is an abolitionist tool. It's another way that if we humble ourselves, we can learn a lot from the cosmos. Like they know a lot more than us. They're older, much older than us. And I think about then Uranus and the outer planets and how those outer planets didn't come into the human sight until the modern era. Right. And I'm like, that's for a reason, because they were like, y'all gonna be fucking up. Like Uranus said, okay, I need you, we're gonna come online in 17. This ain't working, y'all, Pluto and all the like. And so when I think about that in the astrology chart, Uranus is on in my first house of Scorpio, right on my ascendant, right next to right on my ascendant and right on my Lilith. So it's Lilith, Uranus, ascendant right there. And something I had to realize, and my people helped me ancestrally, and you helped me think about this too, what you just said is, I break things. Uranus is a planet of revolution and change and electricity, right? And pivots. And so change becomes the stability, essentially, of Uranus itself. And so when I thought about that, it's like, I break stuff. So in institutions, there's a way that if I tell people, if you're going to hire me in, like, shit's going to change. Like, even if I think I'm just not doing anything, even if I just want to maintain, I thought when I went to Brown, I was like, I'm just going to maintain. Like, I'm not going to do too much. It was the first job I had where I didn't have to write a grant to pay for my damn position. Right. So I thought maybe I would have some security. That's where, Spirit was funny. They're like, we're going to give you some security and see how secure it is. Right. And when I was there, I was like, I'm not going to be too much. I'm not going to do too much. Right. And then, of course, what happened? I did too much because that's just all I know how to do. But by doing too much, it was just I was creating, right? I just wanted to create, and I was curious and innovate. I thought I was innovating with folks who were like me, the justice and stuff. And then what happened? I got on stage at a DEI thing, 500 people, and I accidentally shined. Right. And then that was the downfall. That's when it was time to go, but I didn't. I stayed. Right. And there's this interesting space where it's like, I'm saying all this, y'all, to say that Tracie's giving us a gift because she's showing us, and with her story, that we have different ways we show up in this world and our energy. This is difference, right? This is what difference looks like. But we're so uncomfortable even being different ourselves because we're taught to be disciplined, to buy into scripts, that when we do show up in that difference and we do break things or do disrupt or whatever, we then think it's our fault, when in actuality, that's our ancestors and our people saying, no, that's actually what you're supposed to do. So do we believe that? And I think you showing how you have believed it because you have a relationship and you also trust it, even as you're going through your own journey, it shows us that it's also not supposed to be perfect. You're always going to go through ups and downs and kind of figuring it out, because that's actually what living is. It's experiences, not accolades and quote unquote successes. So I really
And it's not
appreciate.
hard stops too. I
Yes,
love what you just said about your own story, because we're not, we're not predicting, we're saying what has happened.
yes,
So yeah, because I think, there may be a 10-year tenure, for me. And certainly I've been places, longer than 3 or 4 years. But what I know is that when I'm called to a space to do something, usually the life cycle of that is going to take around that time. And then there's going to be a clear, very clear, for me, path onward. And
Mhm.
I have saved myself a lot of heartache by learning it. And I'll give you an example because I love what you said about getting on the stage. I remember when I was living in Seattle and working at Seattle Public Library, and I loved my job so much, and I loved what was happening in terms of my own writing, and I was really feeling so much closer to spirit. And you talk about really living in the natural world. The Seattle that I lived in at that time was not nearly as built up, so I could walk down to the lake, just a couple blocks from my house, and sit with the trees and the geese,
Mhm.
and really just listen. But I was started to feel, right after my mother died and I was still living in Seattle, I started to feel it was time for me to move on. And I didn't want to. I could imagine moving on eventually, but at that moment, I remember wrestling with it, just the deep knowing that my time there was coming to an end. And I wanted to push back on that so hard. I remember I went home one day, and I walked in, and it was raining a little bit outside, but Seattle drizzle. When I walked into my apartment, it was torrential water coming through all of the sockets, everything. Now I have been dealing with this idea that I needed to leave, and I didn't want to. But when I walked into the house and I saw that, I was even afraid to turn on the lights, for fear of possible electrocution. I something said, before you call the building, the person who owned the building, before you do that, just stand for a minute and see what's happening here. And I walked through the entire house, and water pouring through the fixtures in the kitchen, water pouring through the bathroom, everywhere. And I finally called, the owner of the house, and I said, something is happening. He rushed over. He luckily lived in the neighborhood, and it turned out that my neighbors above, were traveling, and somehow they have forgotten to turn off the tub, and it was overflowing, and it had rushed through their entire apartment, and so was finding its outlets through my electrical outlets. But
Oh my goodness.
between the time that I came in and saw it, and he came and he was able to address the situation, I knew I had to move, that the decision was made, that it was really, really clear for me, and it remains clear to me, that obedience is better than sacrifice. That what I saw
Mhm.
there, and what it made me feel, that I didn't want to leave that beautiful apartment. I didn't want to leave the view. I didn't want to leave some of the natural world that I come to enjoy and even take for granted, in Seattle. But it was my time to go. And so what I want to say is that I don't want to make it seem as if I just put my finger up and, there I know it's time to go. Oftentimes there are things like that that will occur, either a profound success or a shift that says your time is through. And I've learned to listen to that. I've learned it's not the end of my work. It may be the end of what I was supposed to do there, or maybe something changes and I can do something different. But I want to say that because I do think that we're always grieving, also to a sense of loss, or I feel like so connected, or this is my big shot, or this is the
Yeah.
best position I've ever had, or the most pay, or the title. But believe me, the work will continue, and take
Mhm.
on profound and delightful, sometimes really, really delightful turns. But I wanted to say that because I do think that we hold on too hard. And in fact, some of
Yeah.
what the issues that we're seeing in the world that are the most problematic is because people are trying to hold on to position, to title, to wealth that they didn't earn, to wealth that was stolen, and maybe the positionality that they had comes with, simultaneously, the oppression of others, but they still want to hold on. I think this is the time to surrender, to let go, allow in serendipity, sunlight, be led, be like, be willing to adventure. Maybe that is, maybe root work is also pushing us to a more expanded life. And that's what I trust. I
Mm.
trust that when when it's time for me to go, that I'm not going to despair. I'm going to something that is more profound and more exciting than I could have ever imagined. And that's usually the case.
I love that. Thank you for that, Tracy, because I think that's a great I appreciate that further explanation because when I listened to you talk, it was so clear. It's like you were talking about the impact of what decay is in our society is not knowing how to let go, right? Like we hold on, and then why that will always lead to a lack of imagination, right? Because we can't imagine anything different or bigger. We don't realize that there are different things we can experience. So, like you're explaining essentially another essence of what life is. Life is about experience, it's about understanding, it's about movement, it's about change, right? So you really it's like you are learning how to work with the energy of change and it's not always and I think we have to also let go of this idea that it's always going to be quote unquote easy or like it's just going to like magically open up. It's like no, like you just said, my shit got flooded. And I had a choice. I
Right.
could have that was a crossroad that was really forced. Either I could have stayed and think about this too. How and for the listeners too, because how many of you would have been like, "Well, screw it. I still going to stay. I'm just going to give me a shop vac." Like, how many of you would try to clean it up, right? And really forced it, and versus being like, "No, this is my son. I got to go. I already thought about it, and I walked in. I can't turn my light. I'm gonna kill myself, literally." Right. So I right?
Right.
So I think that's a beautiful also example of like, okay, do we listen? Like we get the signs, but do we know how to listen and be able to flow, right? So that's also change, right? It's like learning how to work with an energy of change in a society overall, like you just said, is really kind of we're also very allergic to like
Right.
facing reality. Like we want to like and we understand change, which is not really change. It's the same, but just a little shifts, right? A little taint or something. It's like this idea of being the first, like you put a black or brown person or queer person in, so now it's changed, but everything's still the same. It's just a little taint, right? And if you try to change it, then you become a problem. So I think that it's really a great way for us to understand why the crossroads is so important because it invites us to sit with the energy of change. But again, it can seem very chaotic when we don't know what that energy and we're afraid of it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And we're talking, in some cases about institutions, but that same thing happens in relationship. It
Oh
happens in our
my God,
homes,
yes.
and how we, one of the things that was really amazing for me over the last I would say 15 or 20 years of my life was to really heal my relationship with my father. Because my mom and dad
Mm.
divorced really early, and I um always had my father, but I think there was a way in which I had some resentment that there was that distance, whatever that distance is, that can happen. And I think my father was in his way, a really definitely a very funny and really outgoing person, but his expression of love to a child was very different. And so I was so used to my mother and my grandmother well, my grandmother was a little bit more stoic, but my grandfather and mother really were able to display a lot of tenderness. And so because of that, I think I imagined that my dad might feel differently about me than my mother. And because of that, it took me a while. It took me after my mom passed away and really wanting to close the gap between us to begin to understand that my father loved me also very profoundly, but that his way of outpicturing it was different. And his friends would say, "Oh, your father talks about you so much." Even, as he passed away, friends of his would say that. And it reminds me that, we love and we show our love so differently. But I want to just say this is reminding me that the conversation that we're having about sometimes institutions and how we might show up in institutions or try to be certain things, or sometimes feel like, we need to dig in or move on, because any of those steps could have been the right steps, right? Someone could have said, you know what, I
Mhm.
love this apartment so much, I'm going to commit to this apartment. I'm just going to stay here. But I had already been wrestling with the fact that I felt like I needed
Right.
to move on. And that was just a reminder that, there was some real cues there. But what I will say is that I feel like there could be somebody listening to this conversation and understanding that it may be just you becoming more committed to being who you really are on a deep and radical level that might actually open up space or free up space for you to heal or begin to heal relationships in your family, or to be able
Yes.
to, where, because decay is also a part of an organic process, if things are no longer working, to learn, like the tree does, to use it for fuel, to use it for growth, but not to
Yes.
hold on to it. The tree doesn't hold on to those
Mhm.
decaying leaves. It knows that it will actually grow if it lets them go, let them fall around, its roots, and be absorbed that way. And so I think we can learn a lot, as we've said throughout this conversation, from the living world. But this might be the time for us to heal our homes, to heal our relationships,
Yeah.
to heal ourselves so that we can show up in these institutions and heal them too, but to really understand that it is a connected process, and that we cannot be effective, as you said, Nicole, just doing one thing. Like, we can't be a good healer if we're a nasty person. We can't be a good healer if we have these like wild relationships that are just dysfunctional all around us. Like, it doesn't work like that. We can't sort of like smoke, smoke will go into the smoking section. I mean, or you can have a smoke-free section if you have a smoking section next to it. So we have to understand that we're all connected, and our work as healers, it has to be, we have to think of ourselves, really sort of in the round.
And that's a great, honestly, and that's an on point message. Like it's actually creepy because we're recording this on January 25th, and if you follow Western astrology, it's the full moon in Leo. And so you just gave a perfect like example of Leo Aquarius axis because Pluto just moved into Aquarius, and so there's an opposition happening right now. And Leo is the self, right? It's the heart, it's the child, it's being childlike. And when you read Leo outside of patriarchy, it's really asking us, can we step into our sense of self? Can we step into our light? Can we unapologetically allow the curiosity and play and creativity to come out so that we can figure out then who we want to be in relationship with? Aquarius, the collectives we're in. And with Pluto being right there, Pluto is really at like, it's a collective saying, you now have had 15 years of looking at power through a Capricornian lens. Do you actually like this or not? And if you don't, what are you going to do? Because
Ooh,
you have the responsibility because you also have the ability, right? So we are here to help you, right? Because we are co-conspiring with you to live. But as you just said, decay has a purpose. When you hold on to it, it will kill you. But if you let it go, Pluto's lessons is from birth, death comes birth. There's always a transformation, right? So how are we transforming as a collective? By transforming and opposing and looking at the ways that we have inhibited our own sense of self. So you just literally explained the energy of the astrology right now with what you just said. And I think it's really important, right, of us understanding why the self is so important, not in an egotistical way, not an individualistic way, but a true reckoning of who we are and where we come from so that we can come together to figure out how we want to truly live. So thank you for that, Tracie. I love that breakdown. That was a beautiful example of exactly what's going
oh
on
man,
right
I'm
now.
learning from you. I'm just, yes.
I love it. So I know we've been talking a while. I want to one last question to wrap this up because we talk so much about all kinds of things. I first also want to thank you, Tracie, for your time and your generosity and your vulnerability and storytelling, right? Because you're also a beautiful storyteller, and I think we need more storytellers in the world right now as another way to learn. Um, and as we learned a lot in this episode, right? Learned the relationship between roots and crossroads and what it means for us to understand those as locations and tools of our liberation, right? And what does it mean to start to listen to ourselves and move outside of frames that keep us bounded, right? Especially in the West. And like how you said, is a first world problem. Our first world problems have consequences for the rest of the world, right? When we don't want to face that we need to look at our problems here, regardless, even if you are marginalized. I'm telling this, y'all, I love Black people. I love us. I love our people. But just because we are marginalized within the US does not mean we cannot also enact that same violence to others outside of it as well. And also internally too, right? So these kind of facing of selves and like really grappling with this, right? But underlying all of this, we've been talking about the power of the imagination to help us break free and really get an idea, a better idea of what it truly means to have futures in the present. So for you, as somebody who's a liberatory person who just said, you said my work here is justice and equity, right? What are your abolitionist dreams then? What does the dreamscape for you look like? If you woke up, what does it look like, smell like, sound like? So what does that imagination look like for you?
Yes, well, one thing for sure is that I still hold on to this old dream of 40 acres and a mule. I still hold on to this notion of Black home and land ownership and BIPOC home and land ownership as being important. I don't know. There's something there that is important to me. Um, Maybe in my imagination, there are ways in there to be able to counter some of the unhoused, the growing.
Tracie, I'm so sorry about that. As soon as I answered the question, my whole thing froze. So if you don't mind, if you don't, just go ahead and answer. I can link the
Okay.
tracks.
Yeah, no problem. No problem. It's such a good question. So I would say that, there's something that I still think about, and I don't know why I hold on to this, is this notion of 40 acres and a mule. And
Mm.
and I'm not saying that home and land ownership, are are the prizes of this lifetime, but it is not lost on me that we're talking about climate change and all of this, and we're talking also, we have one of the largest sort of epidemics in this country of people who are unhoused, and that a majority of those people who are unhoused are Black and brown, or poor. And there's something about justice in action that makes me want to see more people with homes and owning land, and maybe using frameworks, in terms of like shared farming and gardening and shared food, and maybe there's some notions of, shared childcare. There's something that makes me think that there might be some new frameworks that can come from seeing more equitable access to home and land ownership. And and also, I think a dream that I have, so that's one, is more inclusive land and home ownership. That's one. And more access to the economic mobility that those two things provide in racialized capitalism. There's another that, maybe I think a lot about Harriet Tubman, and I think about the mobility, if you will, that her being an herbs woman, her being a healer, afforded her. I think, a lot of people know, about Harriet Tubman or Grandma Moses and the Underground Railroad, and her fearlessness there and her fierceness there, and her the effectiveness and accuracy, of her navigation, of those fugitive landscapes. But I don't know how much we know about um, Harriet Tubman as a root worker. Harriet Tubman was such a profound root worker. Because obviously she had to be, because people got sick, and you can imagine the kinds of sicknesses that came also from having to live and camp out in swamps. But she was so well known for being a root worker that when the governor of South Carolina realized that a lot of the war was coming to South Carolina and to swamp conditions, when he needed to set up war hospitals, the name that was on everybody's lips in terms of someone who could be really an effective healer or guardian of or keeper of those spaces, as a war nurse, was Harriet Tubman. And he wrote to Harriet Tubman, even though Harriet Tubman, wasn't literate, and even though he wrote to her at a time in South Carolina where the harshest punishments, according to the Black Code laws, for Black people and enslaved Africans was that they be found either knowing to read or possessing reading material. So he wrote to her at a time, the governor wrote to her at a time in which the very letter that he sent to her was contraband, and that someone, a white person most likely, or someone who knew how to read, would have to decode the letter for her, which was also a punishable offense for white people. One of the stiffest in the slave code laws is that white people be taught reading to or teaching Black people to read. Not reading to, but teaching them to read, reading to them with the intent that they would learn, that those were stiff punishments. But he wrote to her, despite all of that, to ask that she report to South Carolina to oversee some of the war hospitals. That is how profound her skills as a root worker were. So I'm saying this, I'm going out on a limb here, Nicole. I believe that the ways in which today we as people, especially marginalized peoples and continuously oppressed peoples, might be able to transcend any of these institutions, and leading them to justice and equity and healing, is to return to root working. I hold on to abolitionist landscapes through Black and brown and poor home ownership and land ownership, and I hold on to notions of our sovereignty and our freedom, that we would return to a deep understanding of the natural world and how it can equip us for survival. So those are my dreams. Yes.
Oh, shit, that was beautiful. Thank you, Tracie. And that's a beautiful way to wrap up this episode. So I'm going to thank you and for being here. I want to thank the listeners for listening. And if folks want to reach out and work with you or engage your work, how can they do that? I mean, do you like people to talk to you? And if you do, how can they talk to you?
Yeah, yes. So even though Rootwork Gallery, the gallery that I operated for 4 years in Chicago, is on hiatus right now, it still has both an active Facebook and Instagram page. And so many people contact me there. Definitely please do. So it's Rootwork Gallery, all one word, on Instagram, and it's Rootwork, one word followed by gallery, on Facebook. Definitely reach out. Let me know what you think about, what has been said, ideas of your own. And I want to thank you, Nicole. You really are doing incredible, needed work and right on time work. So thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you. And I'll have the links to all of everything that Tracie mentioned in the show notes as well, y'all. So thank you all for joining, and stay tuned for episode 2, where we're going to continue this whole season talking about different ideas of Rootworks and Crossroads with different folks and myself, talking it through the lens of Abolitionist Dreamscapes. All right, y'all, keep dreaming. Until next time.